All right, welcome. This is our first video for the Anatomy and Physiology 2 lab. One thing I want to point out is a lot of the lecture we actually covered in A&P 1 at the very end, but basically covering the central nervous system. But normally we save the lab material for the beginning of A&P 2. So hopefully some of this may be a review for you. And so what we're doing is we're looking at a couple of models and also looking at the sheep brain. All right, and I do want to make a point about the sheep brain. The sheep brain are usually already dissected, so you're not going to be grabbing a scalpel or a scissors and cutting things open. Everything's already cut open. And note that we do not throw the sheep brains in the biohazard because, again, they're kind of expensive. We have to use these over and over again. And so make sure that if you remove a sheep brain from a bucket, put it back in a specific bucket, and then these buckets will basically go in the refrigerator. So let's talk about some of the models that I have on this first laboratory practical. There's a couple of brain models that we basically have in the lab. Half of them I like, half of them I don't like, all right? And so the two brain models that I'm going to be focusing on, that I've actually got the pictures on, that I'm going to test you on, are these brain models right here. So we got this one right here. This is the whole brain model right here. All right. I do want to make a point. You can take this apart, but sometimes it's hard to get back together. And especially for beginning students thinking like, well, I have no idea how to stick these things back together again. So try not to take this apart. All right. But this is the whole brain model. And then we have another one, which is kind of an old model. All right. But it still works well. And this is another whole brain model. But what I like about this one is we actually have a mid-sagittal section, all right? So again, if you look at the notes for the lab, you can actually see this is basically the mid-sagittal section that I basically have. So those are the brain models that I'm going to be testing you on. Another model that we have is something referred to as the brainstem model. Remember, the brainstem is actually composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. It has a couple of accessory structures surrounding it, but that's basically what the midbrain is. And notice that anything that's in yellow is a cranial nerve. So again, we're going to learn some of these cranial nerves. This model over here, this is the ventricular model or ventricular system model because the brain actually has 4 ventricles, all right? So we're going to go over that. And then finally, our last model over here is basically a horizontal section of the spinal cord, all right? A horizontal section of the spinal cord. I do have some sheep brains out, and hopefully during this video, I'm going to show you some of the structures on the sheep brain. So the first thing we want to do is start off on the whole brain model, all right? So I'm going to pull this up. This is basically the whole brain. This entire area right here, all right, this entire area right here is called the cerebrum, all right, it's called the cerebrum. It's highly developed in mammals, especially humans, all right, but notice that the cerebrum will actually express something referred to as the cerebral cortex, all right. The cerebral cortex has a vast surface area. So thinking like, well, how can the cerebral cortex have such a vast surface area? Well, it's actually due to these little grooves and ridges that are basically found in the cerebrum, all right? So any sort of groove, all right, each groove is called a sulcus, all right? Sulci is actually plural. And each ridge right here and here, this is called a gyrus, all right? Gyrus is singular, gyri is plural, all right? So again, when you look at the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres, all right, they're basically full with gyri and sulci, which actually increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex, all right? Cerebral cortex plays all sorts of roles in like sensing. It could be somatosensory perception, hearing, taste, seeing, motor movements such as moving, behavior, motivation. That's what it does, all right? So the cerebral cortex is really highly developed in humans, all right? Now, the next thing we're going to look at is anytime you have a sulcus, all right, that's either very deep or very wide, we don't call it a sulcus anymore. We call it a fissure, all right? So notice there's at least 2 fissures that I want to point out. The main one is this one right here that basically separates the right cerebral hemisphere from the left cerebral hemisphere. This is called the median longitudinal fissure. The median longitudinal fissure. Now there's another one in some books call this a sulcus. This is called the lateral sulcus or the lateral fissure. Sometimes it's given a proper name, so they call it the lateral sulcus or fissure of Sylvius, all right? You don't have to add the word of Sylvius. That's what most medical students call it, all right? But if you use of Sylvius, I will smile upon you. All right, so again, this is the lateral sulcus or lateral fissure of Sylvius, and actually it's going to separate the temporal lobe from the rest of the brain. So when we basically talk about the cerebrum, all right, it's actually divided into a couple of different lobes. What we're going to do is we're going to discuss 4 of them, all right? So again, if you know some of the bones of the skull, it's actually relatively easy. So notice this is the anterior portion of the body. This is the posterior portion of the body. So this thing right here, this is the frontal lobe, all right? So again, the frontal lobe is actually surrounded by the frontal bone, all right? Usually there's going to be a sulcus right here, all right, a sulcus right here that extends all the way up. This is called the central sulcus, and the central sulcus is actually the border between the frontal lobe and then this lobe right here, which is called the parietal lobe, all right, the parietal lobe. So we've got the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and then this lobe here towards the back is called the occipital lobe. Now, when you look at the outer surface of the brain, there's not really any border that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. However, if you look at the mid-sagittal section, again, this is anterior, here's the posterior. If you look at the mid-sagittal section of the brain, you're basically going to have this sulcus right here, this sulcus right here. This is called the parieto-occipital sulcus, and this is the border that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. All right, so again, if you look at the mid-sagittal brain, much of this is basically the frontal lobe. This over here is the parietal lobe. This is the occipital lobe. And when you turn it around and look at the outside, this portion right here is the temporal lobe. All right, this is the temporal lobe. Now, the next thing we're going to do is actually look at some of the structures on the mid-sagittal section of the brain. All right, so let me pull this back up. I shouldn't have even put it down. All right, so again, we've got the cerebrum, and note this is part of the cerebral hemisphere. This is actually my left cerebral hemisphere. This over here is my right cerebral hemisphere. All right, so again, if you look, each cerebral hemisphere has a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, this is right here, an occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. All right, there's something referred to as the insula, but we're not even going to be able to see the insula in lab, so I'm not going to really focus on it. Now, let's go into some of the other structures that we can actually find in the brain. Now, one of the things that basically connects the right cerebral hemisphere to the left cerebral hemisphere is this structure right here. This structure right here, this entire structure. This is called the corpus callosum, all right? So this is responsible for communication between the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. Now, notice when you actually look at this, let me pull it up a little close right here. Anytime you see, other than the corpus callosum, anytime you see these little yellow dots, these also are communication points between the right and left and vice versa, all right? And we'll talk about at least 2 of these a little bit later on, all right? So let's look at this. This is the corpus callosum right here. This structure right here, it looks like it's coming off the corpus callosum, but it's not coming off the corpus callosum. It's basically connecting portions of the cerebral cortex with the hypothalamus right here. This structure right here is called the fornix, all right? This structure right here is called the fornix. Now note, there's going to be a cavity here. You can actually see it more prominent on the other one. There's a little cavity right here. This is called the lateral ventricle, all right, the lateral ventricle. And you can kind of see it here, all right, although it's not as deep here. And normally, all right, it's actually separated because you have you're going to have a right lateral ventricle and a left lateral ventricle. It's going to be separated by a thin membrane called the septum pellucidum, all right? I'm not going to quiz you over the septum pellucidum, but sometimes we can actually see it when we're actually doing a mid-sagittal section of the sheep brain. All right, so again, making sure we know this, corpus callosum, this is the fornix, this cavity right here is the lateral ventricle. Now look at this area right here, all right? This is actually the third ventricle, all right? It's very narrow and it basically lies along the midline, all right? But this is the third ventricle. But notice, all right, there's going to be a connection between the right and the left. This thing right here, this little yellow dot right here, is called the interthalamic adhesion. That's basically where the right thalamus will communicate with the left thalamus. Thalamus, I consider to be the primary sensory relay center of the brain. Pretty much almost everything that you sense, with the exception of smell, has to go through the thalamus, and it's basically going to send it to the right areas of the brain for vision, or for taste, or for hearing, or for equilibrium, or whatever, even somatosensory, all right? Is it light pain? Is it, fine touch? Is it, anything, all right? So again, that's the thalamus, all right? Now, below the thalamus, you're going to have this area right here, which is called the hypothalamus, all right? And you're going to have this little yellow dot right here. This little yellow dot, that's the corpus callosum. That's basically where 50% of the nerve fibers from the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve 2, will basically cross over. We're going to take a look at this a little bit later on the brainstem model. This structure right here that I'm showing you right here, this is called the hypophysis or pituitary gland. The hypophysis or the pituitary gland. And this structure over here, this is called the pineal gland or the pineal body. Both the pituitary gland or the hypophysis and then the pineal body or pineal gland, basically they're endocrine structures, all right? They're actually either produced of epithelial cells or they basically have input from neurons, all right, that actually secrete a blood-borne ligand, which is called a hormone, all right? Now, if we look at this, if you're in either the lateral ventricle or the third ventricle, all right, you're a fluid. That fluid is called the cerebrospinal fluid, all right? So cerebrospinal fluid can be formed in the lateral ventricle, but it can also be formed in the third ventricle or the fourth ventricle. But if you're a drop of cerebrospinal fluid, all right, formed in the lateral ventricle, well, how do you make your way out to get back into the circulation? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to go from the lateral ventricle. There's a little interventricular foramen, which I'm going to show you a little bit later on, that connects the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. Then when you wind up in the third ventricle, you're going to go down this little canal right here. This is called the cerebral aqueduct. You can actually see someone took a pencil and marked it, but this right here, this is the cerebral aqueduct. And then you're going to wind up here in the fourth ventricle. So this right here, this is the fourth ventricle, all right? Now note, the cerebrospinal fluid can actually go down into the spinal cord, into the central canal, but the central canal is actually a dead-end pathway, all right? So if the cerebrospinal fluid wants to get back into the circulation, all right, it has to go out 3 different apertures. One is called the median aperture, all right? And then the other 2 are called lateral apertures. And we're going to look at these a little bit later on. We look at the ventricular system model, all right? Now, a couple of things I want to point out. This area right here, this is called the midbrain, all right? So again, this is the midbrain. This area right here is called the pons, and then this area right here is called the medulla oblongata. Now, what is this little kind of brownish area right here? This is referred to as the cerebellum, all right, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is actually composed of 2 cerebellar lobes. This is the left cerebellar lobe, and it's actually interconnected by something referred to as the vermis, and we'll actually see that when we actually look at the sheep brain, all right? But I do want to make a point about the cerebellum. The white matter of the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae. The word arbor vitae literally means white tree, all right? So again, the white tree, try not to put white tree, put arbor vitae. That's the correct name of it, all right? If you're a big fan of Lord of the Rings, the White Tree of Gondor, I actually had a couple of students years ago. They said, well, it was a White Tree of Gondor. I said, don't put that on there, but they did it anyway, all right? So anyway, the white matter right here, the arbor vitae, all right? So this is the mid-sagittal section of the brain, the whole brain. Now, the next thing we're going to do is go to the brainstem. Right, stop. All right, so this is the brainstem, and what we're doing is we're looking at the anterior side, all right? Remember that the brainstem is actually composed of the midbrain, all right, the pons, this entire thing is the pons, and then this thing right here, which is called the medulla oblongata. So you put the midbrain, the pons and the medulla oblongata, you basically have the brainstem. It often has a couple of accessory structures basically surrounding it. Obviously, one is the spinal cord, which is right underneath the medulla oblongata, and then these two structures right here, which is actually a part of the diencephalon. All right. So first of all, what we're going to do is go from the top, go to the bottom, and remember we're looking at the anterior side first. And once we're done with the anterior side, I'm going to flip it around, and we're going to do the posterior side. So first of all, these things right here, this is the thalamus, all right? This is the thalamus. We can kind of see, if you use your imagination right here, this is basically where the right thalamus is actually connected to the left thalamus. This is the interthalamic adhesion, although we don't have a mid-sagittal section of the brainstem. Now, again, when you look at this, all right, anything that's yellow is either a nerve or a tract. So what's the difference between a nerve and a tract? Well, both of these, all right, are clusters, all right, of nerve fibers or axons, all right? But a nerve is a cluster of nerve fibers or axons that you're going to find in the peripheral nervous system, whereas a tract is a cluster of nerve fibers or axons that you're going to find in the central nervous system, all right? And actually looking at the brainstem model, we're actually going to look at 11 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The only one that we're missing on here is cranial nerve 1, which is the olfactory nerve. I want to show it to you now just to make sure, all right? So if you look over here, this structure right here, this is actually a portion of cranial nerve 1, all right? Although I say cranial nerve 1, this area right here, this is called the olfactory tract because it's not in the peripheral nervous system, it's actually in the central nervous system. And these things that are right here, these are referred to as olfactory bulbs, all right? But again, it's a component of cranial nerve 1 or the olfactory nerve, all right? So let's talk about this. So again, we've got the thalamus right here, all right? Next thing we're going to look at is this structure right here, all right? It's cut. Here's one on one side, one on the other. This is cranial nerve 2 or the optic nerve. I do want to make a point when you write this, if you're writing, say, hey, identify this structure right here. I will accept two possible answers. Cranial nerve 2 or the optic nerve. However, if you use numbers, you're going to have to use Roman numerals because if you use just the regular numbers like 2, you're not going to get full credit for it. I'm going to take some off, all right? So you can use cranial nerve 2 using Roman numerals, or you just call it the optic nerve, all right? Now, I do want to make a point. The optic nerve, once it reaches this point right here, so let me point this out. This one right here is called the optic chiasma. This is where 50% of the optic nerve fibers will cross over. In other words, it's going to go from right to left and from left to right, all right? So this is the optic chiasma. So again, making sure you know this, optic nerve, optic chiasma, and then this right here, what the hell is that? That's the optic tract, all right, because that's actually inside the central nervous system. Now, I don't have time to lecture over it right now, all right? But if you ask me when we're talking about special senses, the optic nerve, it's not a nerve at all. It's actually a tract, all right? So thinking like, well, how come the optic nerve isn't really a nerve? Ask me that. I may actually present that when I talk about special senses, all right? So again, one more time, optic nerve. This is the optic chiasma right here, and this is the optic tract, all right? And note again, this is all derived from the diencephalon, which is actually not part of the midbrain, all right? But the rest of the cranial nerves, all right, cranial nerves 3 all the way through 12, either come from the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla oblongata. So let's go to the midbrain, all right? So when we go over here, this structure right here, we only see the anterior side right here. These are referred to as the cerebral peduncles. All right, cerebral peduncles, that's the anterior portion of the midbrain. But notice we're going to have at least one cranial nerve coming off the anterior portion of the midbrain, all right? And it's this thing right here. So there's one on one side, one on the other. This is cranial nerve 3 or the oculomotor nerve, all right? Cranial nerve 3 or the oculomotor nerve. The only other nerve that actually comes off the midbrain comes off the dorsal aspect. So we're not actually going to see it, although you can kind of see it just a little bit from the side. We're going to talk about that when I do a 180 and we talk about the posterior aspect of the brainstem, all right? Now let's go to the pons, all right? So the pons is this structure right here. Let me use my blunt probe So it basically starts right here superiorly and it basically ends right here inferiorly. So this whole thing right here, this is the pons, all right? And there's actually going to be 4 cranial nerves that basically come off the pons, all right? So cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4 come off the midbrain, and then cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, and 8 come off the pons. And so first cranial nerve we're going to look at is this one right here. You're going to find one on the right side, one on the left side. This is called cranial nerve 5 or the trigeminal nerve, all right, because it's one of the largest of the cranial nerves, and it's basically going to have both sensory functions and motor functions, all right. So again, this is cranial nerve 5. Then we're going to have cranial nerve 6. So let me point this out. It's at the very base of the pons, and this is it right here. So this is cranial nerve 6, all right. So cranial nerve 6 is called the abducens nerve. And then if we tilt this around, we're going to have another cranial nerve, which is right here. This was referred to as cranial nerve 7 or the facial nerve. And then this cranial nerve right here is cranial nerve 8, which is called the vestibulocochlear nerve, all right, the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then underneath the pons, we're going to basically start superior right here, and we're going to end. So this area right here, this whole area right here, this is the medulla oblongata. And again, there's going to be 4 more cranial nerves here. So cranial nerve 9, 10, 11, and 12 are going to be found in medulla oblongata. So let's look at this. Cranial nerve 9 is this one right here. Cranial nerve 9 is called the glossopharyngeal nerve. So cranial nerve 9, then right below cranial nerve 9, you're going to have cranial nerve 10, which is called the vagus nerve. And then right underneath cranial nerve 10 or the vagus nerve, you're going to have this nerve right here that has both cranial output and spinal cord output. That's called the spinal accessory nerve. So cranial nerve 11 is the spinal accessory nerve. Well, what about cranial nerve 12, which is called the hypoglossal nerve? Well, the hypoglossal nerve, all right, is actually situated more anterior. So here's one over here, and here's one over here, right? So this is cranial nerve 12, or the hypoglossal nerve, and note, it's going to lie in between the pyramid of the medulla oblongata and the olives of the medulla oblongata. So the pyramids are more medial, close to the midline, whereas the olives, all right, are going to be more lateral. Now, one question that's asked quite frequently, so how do you know where the medulla oblongata ends and the spinal cord begins, all right? And a lot of the models actually lack this, which is sad, but when we basically had these models printed off, I'm thinking like, you're going to have to put the decussation of the pyramids, because if not, it's going to be hard to tell where the medulla oblongata stops and the spinal cord begins. So if you look at this, right here, all right, it's this area right here. This is called the decussation of the pyramids. This is basically where the pyramidal tract that basically composes most of your motor ability for your skeletal muscles. That's where they cross over. In other words, one goes to the right side to the left side, or the left side to the right side. That's where they cross over. And it's at that point where the medulla oblongata ends and the spinal cord begins. And I do want to make a point. If you look at the skull surrounding it, right here at the decussation of the pyramids, the foramen magnum. All right, hopefully you remember that from last semester, right? So the foramen magnum on the occipital bone, anything superior to the foramen magnum is the brain, anything that's inferior to the foramen magnum is the spinal cord, all right? So again, that's the decussation of the pyramids. Now what I want to do is I'm going to do a 180-degree rotation of this, and we're going to actually be looking at the posterior aspect of the brain stem, all right? So again, this is the thalamus, all right? So again, we've got the right thalamus and the left thalamus. Now note that this structure right here that I've got the blunt probe on, this right here is the pineal gland or the pineal body. It actually produces melatonin, which is responsible for circadian rhythms. And then right below the pineal gland or pineal body, you see 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. This whole thing is called the corpora quadrigemina. And I like it because it's got that word quad means 4. So if you actually look at this, all right, these things that are up here, these are referred to as the superior colliculi. Superior colliculi. Caliculi is actually plural. If I'm only pointing out one, it's called the superior colliculus. So the superior caliculi are actually responsible for visual reflexes, Then below the superior caliculi, you've got two more bumps right here. These are referred to as the inferior caliculi, all right? And again, singular right here, this is the inferior colliculus. And the inferior colliculi are responsible for auditory reflexes. And basically, the superior caliculi, the inferior caliculi, which together form the corpora quadrigemina, actually form the dorsal aspect of the midbrain, all right? The dorsal aspect of the midbrain. So one thing I want to show you off, we're missing something here. What the hell are we missing? Look at this. Oh, it's this thing right here. This is the cerebellum, all right? This is the cerebellum. So when we basically printed the brainstem out, we basically took the cerebellum off, although we still have some communication pathways, all right, between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. So first of all, let me show you something. We have this little rhomboid cavity right here. Let me pull this up, make sure that the camera can see it. This little rhomboid cavity right here, this is actually the fourth ventricle, But notice on either side, either the right or the left, all right, we're going to have three different peduncles which actually communicate with the cerebellum. So let me show this to you, all right? So this one right here, this is called the superior cerebellar peduncle. And what this is going to do is going to allow communication between the cerebellum and the midbrain, all right? Then this one over here, just to make sure I show you this, it's this one right here. This is called the middle cerebellar peduncle, and this is going to provide communication between the cerebellum and the pons. And then this one right here, it's this one right here. This is called the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and this is basically going to provide communication between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata, all right, the medulla oblongata. One other thing I want to point out, this thing that's coming from the dorsal aspect of the midbrain, that's cranial nerve 4. Cranial nerve 4 is sometimes called the trochlear nerve, So again, this is a model of the brainstem. Next thing I want to point out is the ventricular model, all right? I'm going to try to keep this pretty simple, although I know when you look at it under the notes, I have a lot of things labeled here. There's 4 ventricles, all right? The 2 largest ones are the 2 lateral ventricles. So you're going to have a lateral ventricle on your right side and a lateral ventricle on your left side. And normally they're C-shaped, all right? So again, this whole C-shaped thing right here, this is a lateral ventricle. This is my right one. This is my left one, all right? So again, this is going to be anterior. This is going to be posterior. Notice again, this is a space, all right? So all this gray stuff right here, this is actually cerebrospinal fluid. What they've done is they've basically taken a preserved human brain, all right, injected it with some sort of gel that's going to solidify and then cracked away the brain, and this is what they're stuck with, all right? Now, whether or not it was actually a real brain or a model of a brain, it's probably a model of a brain, because this looks too, it's probably a model. But anyway, this right here is it's a lateral ventricle. So you have the right lateral ventricle and you have the left lateral ventricle. Notice when you're looking at this model, when you see these pink things, so you can see some pink stuff over here, you can see pink stuff over here and pink stuff over here. What the hell does that mean, all right? Well, this is areas of the ventricles, basically areas called the choroid plexus. This is actually where the cerebrospinal fluid is actually generated, all right? So cerebrospinal fluid is actually generated all the time in the ventricles, both lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, all right? But again, if it's going to flow, we got to basically generate it and get rid of it. In other words, put it back into the circulatory system, all right? So how are we going to do this? So let's just say I'm a drop of cerebrospinal fluid that's basically generated in one of the lateral ventricles, all right? So I'm generating the lateral ventricle. Well, how do I get to the third ventricle? Well, what I'm going to do is pass through these little holes, all right? These are referred to as the interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen or foramina, foramen singular, foramina is actually plural, and a lot of times how I learned this, because I learned this in medical school, we call it the interventricular foramen of Monroe, all right? You don't have to add of Monroe onto, although if you put on of Monroe, I will definitely smile on you. I'll give you extra credit, but I'll definitely smile on you. So again, here's the interventricular foramen of Monroe. Here's the other one. If you look at it from the lateral thing, this right here, this is the interventricular foramen of Monroe. And then what's going to happen is you're going to wind up here in this third ventricle. So this right here is the third ventricle. Notice again, you're going to have this little hole right here. This little hole is actually the interventricular, it's the interthalamic adhesion. Interthalamic adhesion, sorry about that. So this is the interthalamic adhesion. And then the cerebrospinal fluid is going to go down this little canal that's right here. This is referred to as the cerebral aqueduct, and basically end right here into the fourth ventricle. Now, keep in mind, again, cerebrospinal fluid can be generated in the fourth ventricle, all right? But notice again, how are we going to get out of the fourth ventricle? Well, there's a couple of ways. We can actually go down into the central canal of the spinal cord, but the central canal, again, is a dead-end space, all right? So again, if we're going to the central canal, we're stuck, we're going to have to go back up. There's actually 3 apertures, all right? There's one that's medial, and 2 that's lateral. And although it's hard to tell on this model, this is called the median aperture. Sometimes it's called the median aperture of Magendie. And then we got 2 lateral apertures, and these are referred to as the lateral apertures of Luschka. And again, you don't have to put of Magendie or of Luschka, but again, it's like of Monroe. If you put it there, I will smile upon you. And finally, our last one is basically a horizontal section of the spinal cord, all right? So notice again the spinal cord, regardless of whether or not you're looking at the cervical segments, the thoracic segments, the lumbar segments, the sacral segments, or the coccygeal segments, it's fairly, fairly similar, all right? Although there are some differences, all right? And we'll talk about that during the lecture, especially during the autonomic nervous system. But if we actually look at this, all right, let's see if we can actually see things. What happened is we got the gray matter, all right, that's in the middle, and it's actually surrounded by the white matter. So let's go over this real fast. This is called the dorsal horn. This is called the ventral horn. Now note, what's another name for dorsal? Posterior. So there are some textbooks, all right, that'll actually call this the posterior horn. And again, what's another name for ventral? Anterior. So again, dorsal horn or posterior horn, and this is the ventral horn or anterior horn, all right? Now this one right here basically lacks another horn, which is called the lateral horn. The lateral horn is basically equated with autonomic activity, which basically means that this section of the spinal cord does not have autonomic activity, all right? Now surrounding this, all right, we're going to have some white matter. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to divide it into 3 pairs of white columns, all right? So again, this area right here, this is called the dorsal funiculus, but again, what's another name for dorsal? We can call it posterior. So again, we call it the posterior funiculus. This area over here is called the lateral funiculus, and then this area right here is called the ventral funiculus. And again, what's another name for ventral? Anterior. So again, you can call it the ventral funiculus or the anterior funiculus. One thing I want to point out is that all spinal nerves are considered to be mixed. In other words, it basically has both sensory function and motor function, all right? So the sensory portion is basically the dorsal aspect. The motor portion is actually the ventral aspect, all right? So here you have the dorsal root, which is sensory and function. Here you have the ventral root, which is in motor function. Note that this thing right here is a ganglion, all right? A ganglion is basically a cluster of gray matter, and usually gray matter is basically a cluster of cell bodies of neurons that occur in the peripheral nervous system. So here, dorsal root ganglion, there are some textbooks that call these the spinal ganglion, all right? But once the dorsal root and ventral root converge, you're going to have the spinal nerve, all right? This is the spinal nerve, all right? So again, horizontal section of the spinal cord. Now, what I'm going to do is I want to show you, I'm going to have to do this really fast because I know we're running out of time, but I'm going to have to put on a pair of gloves. So anytime you're handling something, all right, make sure you put on gloves. A lot of things that we get in, at least nowadays, are shipped in a preservative that's not supposed to be toxic, but some of these brain, you can actually smell the formaldehyde. And anytime we get the formaldehyde kind of evaporates or the preservative evaporates away, we actually make formaldehyde and stick it in. And formaldehyde, it's not good for you. All right. So again, put on a pair of gloves. All right. And what we're going to do is look at some of this stuff. All right. Now, the sheep brain is a lot different than the human brain, but what we're going to do is look at the similarities, not the differences, but the similarities, all right? So the first thing I want to show you, oops, is this thing right here. I'm going to pull it forward, but I'm not going to pull it that forward because I don't want the preservative to hit my laptop, all right? So this is a whole sheep brain right here. And notice it's covered in this white connective tissue. This white connective tissue is referred to as the dura mater, all right, the dura mater. And usually when we basically look at sheep brains, all right, we basically want to remove the dura. But keep in mind, when you remove the dura, the neural tissue is very delicate, all right? So again, what we've done is we've removed the dura, and this is what it looks like. So again, you can kind of tell the difference between this has the dura mater, and this basically lacks the dura mater. So let's go over some of the structures of the whole brain first, and then what I'm going to show you is the mid-sagittal section of the brain. So this portion right here is the cerebrum, all right? And you can actually see the grooves right here, which are the sulcus, and basically these ridges right here, which is the gyrus. You can actually see this large sulcus right here, which is called the median longitudinal fissure, that basically separates the right from left cerebral hemispheres, all right? Now, when we tilt this over, well, let's hold on this. Underneath this, all right, this structure right here is referred to as the cerebellum. And you can notice, again, we have the two cerebellar hemispheres, and notice there's no fissure. All right, actually we have a structure right here. It's called the vermis, all right? And the word vermis literally means worm, all right? So whoever named this first thinks, hey, this structure right here, hey, it looks like a worm, so we're going to call it the vermis. So that's the name of it, all right? So again, that's the vermis. Now, the rest of this, all right, is probably going to be the spinal cord until we turn around. So what we're doing is we're actually looking at the dorsal section of the sheep brain. Here, what we're going to be doing is look at the ventral section of the sheep brain, all right? And so again, you can actually see the cerebrum, but things I want to point out, this right here, these are the olfactory bulbs, all right? These structures that are right here, these are the olfactory tracts. We can kind of see where it's cut right here. This is actually where it's cut. This is the optic nerve, all right? You can see the optic chiasma right here, and then these structures over here, this is the optic tract. Now notice there'll be a hypophysis or a pituitary gland, all right? Pituitary gland, once you remove the dura mater, it falls off rather easily. So the pituitary gland isn't actually localized on here, but you can see this structure right here. This right here is the mammary body, all right? This right here is the mammary body. Now this structure right here, this entire structure right here, this is the midbrain. This structure right here, this is the pons, and then this structure right here, this is the medulla oblongata, and then finally right here, this is the spinal cord, all right? So make sure. Olfactory nerve, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract. This is the mammary body. This whole thing right here, all right, and actually this is cranial nerve 3, or the oculomotor nerve. This right here is the midbrain. This area right here, this is the pons. This area right here is the medulla oblongata, and then this right here is the spinal cord. What we're going to do is to finish this up, we're going to look at a mid-sagittal section of the brain. I do want to make a point. This actually has the dura mater. And if you look over here, what the hell is this? This is actually the pituitary gland or the hypophysis, all right? Because once you remove the dura mater, the pituitary gland falls off rather rapidly. So when you look at this, if it basically lacks the dura mater, you're probably not going to see the pituitary gland or hypophysis. So let's look at this. It's going to be very similar to the mid-sagittal section of the brain, all right? So again, you can look at this. This right here, this is the corpus callosum. We can actually see right here, this is actually the lateral ventricle. This right here is the fornix. we can actually see this structure right here, which is the optic chiasma. We can see the interthalamic adhesion right here. We can actually see a small portion of the cerebral aqueduct, all right? This area right here is called the midbrain. This area right here is called the pons. From here to here, this is the medulla oblongata, and this right here is the spinal cord, all right? This structure right here is the cerebellum, and notice again, arbor vitae, the white tree, all right, the white tree. The only other thing I want to point out is if we look from the dorsal aspect and we bend everything down, we can kind of see some structures in here. So notice we've got a structure. If I can see, it's kind of hard to see. If I can pull it up, get out of the way. Hold on. No, you're not going to see it. Can we see it? We're not going to be able to see it on this one. It's going to be hard to see. But we can actually see 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the corpora quadrigemina. Again, these two are the superior caliculi, and these two are the inferior caliculi. What I was looking for is there's going to be a structure right above the superior caliculi called the pineal gland or pineal body. All right. I'll have to pull it out, and I don't know if I can see it on. I can't see it on this one. Can't really see it on that one either. All right. But if you ask me in lab, I will show it to you. All right. I think I'm done with the video. All right. So you have the notes, all right, that are basically on Canvas. You also have the video, all right. So again, go for it. When we do have lab, I will be here. So if you have any questions, please let me know, all right. Good luck, and I will see you on our next laboratory practical, which basically covers the special senses and the reproductive system.